Ces impérialistes n'ont qu'un seul cliché en tête. L'Afrique est l'empire des esclaves. C'est comme ça qu'ils voient l'Afrique. Pour eux, les Africains les appartiennent. Nos terres les appartiennent. Nos sous-sols les appartiennent. Ils n'ont jamais pu changer de logiciel jusqu'aujourd'hui.
Do house slaves still exist in Africa? Following in the footsteps of Malcolm X, Traore has used this term to criticize many African leaders, labeling them as puppets and house slaves of the West. In a recent speech, he held numerous leaders accountable, claiming that they are serving Western interests instead of their own people's needs. He urged these leaders to make a clear decision. If they are willing to sell themselves for money, they should openly admit it. Now is the time to address the wrongs done to Africa. But will these leaders unite and tell the truth for the sake of Africa? Let's find out.
C'est déplorable. Mais comment procède-t-il? C'est malheureusement depuis donc ces années 60 où ces simulacres d'indépendance ont été donnés à l'Afrique. Ils n'ont juste fait que placer des valets locaux à la tête, selon eux, de leur sous-préfecture pour pouvoir continuer à les alimenter.
Many political speeches often fade, but a powerful address can still cause a revolution. Such was the case when Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso, delivered a speech that shook the foundations of African politics and challenged the neocolonial forces still gripping the continent. Traore's words were a call for genuine independence and self-determination, resonating deeply with those who long for true liberation. Traore criticized African leaders who act as puppets for Western powers, drawing a stark line between himself and those he deems house slaves. He argued that Africa's independence has been a scam since the 1960s, with leaders serving their former colonial masters rather than their people. By likening Africa to an empire of slaves in the eyes of the West, Traore emphasized the need for a radical shift in leadership and governance. But what, according to him, drives African leaders to act as puppets for Western powers?
Ces individus continuent toujours, contre vents et marées, à piller l'Afrique, à aider le maître à piller l'Afrique.
Traore's speech began with a harsh critique of certain African leaders, whom he referred to as house slaves. This term, burdened with historical significance, draws a parallel to Malcolm X's famous speech, where he distinguished between the house slave and the field slave. By gathering this imagery, Traore highlighted the betrayal he perceives among leaders who prioritize Western interests over their own people's needs and aspirations.
Ces valets locaux que nous allons qualifier aujourd'hui d'esclaves de salon n'ont d'autre repère que de chercher à vivre comme le maître, à satisfaire le maître et à faire tout ce que le maître lui dicte. Ils volent, ils pillent nos États, amènent tout chez le maître et leur richesse est conservée chez le maître. Ils font tout pour vivre comme le maître et toujours le satisfaire.
Since the 1960s, African countries have gained independence. However, Traore argued that this independence has been largely superficial. Many leaders have continued to act in the interests of their former colonial masters, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and exploitation. Traore's words were a reminder that true independence requires more than just the absence of colonial rule. It demands a fundamental shift in governance and economic structures. The impact of neocolonialism is evident in the persistent inequalities and power imbalances that trouble the continent. Traore's critique highlighted how African leaders have often facilitated these dynamics, whether through corrupt practices, economic policies favoring foreign corporations, or military alliances that serve external interests. By exposing these issues, Traore called for a new breed of leadership, one that is committed to the welfare and prosperity of its people rather than the approval of Western powers. The historical roots of this phenomenon are deeply ingrained. During the colonial era, African leaders were often selected based on their willingness to cooperate with colonial authorities. This created a legacy of leadership that prioritized external interests over national sovereignty. Even after gaining independence, many African countries retained political and economic systems that were designed to benefit the former colonial powers. This legacy has persisted, creating a class of leaders who are more concerned with maintaining their power and wealth than with advancing the interests of their people. Traore's speech also touched on the psychological dimensions of neocolonialism. He argued that many African leaders have internalized the values and beliefs of their former colonial masters, leading them to view their people as inferior and unworthy of true self-determination. This internalized oppression has been one of the most insidious effects of colonialism, as it perpetuates a sense of inferiority and dependency that undermines efforts to achieve genuine independence. Traore's call for a new breed of leadership is not just a critique of the past, it is also a vision for the future. He urged African leaders to reject the values and interests of their former colonial masters and to adopt a new paradigm of governance that prioritizes the welfare and prosperity of their people. This vision includes developing local industries, investing in education and healthcare, and creating fair trade relationships that benefit African producers. As Traore's speech reverberates across the continent, it raises important questions about the future of African governance. Will leaders heed his call to reject neo-colonial influences and prioritize their citizens' needs? Can Africa break free from the chains of external control and chart a path toward genuine self-determination? These questions remain unanswered, but one thing might be easy to answer, which is, how does the West continue to view Africa as an empire of slaves? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
Comment ils exécutent. Savez-vous qui sont ces esclaves de salon? Eh bien, nous allons vous expliquer ce que c'est. Ce sont des individus qui n'ont aucune dignité, qui n'ont aucune morale, qui n'ont aucune personnalité. Mais le maître esclave a toujours su identifier ces individus. Ils sont toujours prêts à trahir leurs frères pour satisfaire le maître. Ils nous ont trahis depuis l'indépendance et d'autres continuent jusqu'aujourd'hui à nous trahir au profit de leur maître.
One of the most striking elements of Traore's speech was his description of Africa as an empire of slaves in the eyes of the West. This metaphor captures the ongoing imperialist attitudes that regard African nations as mere sources of raw materials and cheap labor. Traore's choice of words was a bold accusation of the systemic inequalities and power imbalances that continue to plague the continent. Historically, the exploitation of Africa's resources has been a cornerstone of Western economic dominance. From the slave trade to the extraction of minerals and oil, Africa has been subjected to centuries of loot and abuse. Traore's speech brought this history into focus, reminding his audience that the legacy of imperialism is far from over. In many ways, the continent remains an economic colony, with its wealth funneled outwards and its people left to grapple with poverty and underdevelopment. The mechanisms of neo-colonial control are multifaceted and deeply entrenched. One of the most significant is the structure of global trade, which is heavily skewed in favor of Western nations. African countries are often forced to export raw materials at low prices, while importing finished goods at high prices, creating a cycle of dependency and exploitation. This trade imbalance is worsened by unfair trade agreements and protectionist policies that benefit Western economies at the expense of African development. Multinational corporations also play a crucial role in perpetuating neocolonial control. These corporations often extract vast amounts of wealth from African countries while contributing little to local economies. They exploit cheap labor, evade taxes, and engage in environmentally destructive practices, all with the complicity of local elites. This extraction of wealth not only impoverishes African communities, but also sabotages their ability to develop self-sufficient economies. Financial systems designed to keep African countries in perpetual debt are another key mechanism of neocolonial control. Many African nations are burdened with high levels of debt, much of which was incurred during the colonial period. This debt is often serviced through austerity measures and structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions. which prioritize debt repayment over social and economic development. These measures have had devastating effects on public services, employment, and living standards across the continent. By framing Africa as an empire of slaves, Traore challenged his fellow leaders to confront the harsh realities of their country's economic and political subjugation. He called for a rejection of the status quo and a commitment to policies that prioritize African interests. This vision of sovereignty and self-reliance is not just a political imperative, but a moral one, demanding that leaders place the dignity and welfare of their people above all else. Traore's speech also highlighted the role of external powers in maintaining Africa's subjugation. He pointed to the military interventions, political meddling, and economic coercion that have been used to damage African sovereignty. These actions are often justified in the name of stability, security, or development, but in reality, they serve to protect Western interests and maintain control over Africa's resources. Now the question is, what does true independence look like for African nations today? Traore's speech was not just a critique of the past and present, it was also a cry for the future. He emphasized that African leaders must break free from the chains of neocolonialism and forge a path that prioritizes the welfare and prosperity of their people. He said, "Our resources, our land, and our people are not for sale." True independence, according to Traore, requires a fundamental restructuring of African governance and economics. It means moving away from reliance on foreign aid and investment and instead focusing on building self-sufficient economies. This vision includes developing local industries, investing in education and healthcare, and creating fair trade relationships that benefit African producers. One of the key components of Traore's vision is the development of local industries. By investing in manufacturing and processing facilities, African countries can add value to their raw materials and create jobs for their people. This approach not only boosts local economies, but also reduces dependency on imports. For example, instead of exporting raw cocoa beans, African countries could produce chocolate and other cocoa products, capturing more of the value chain and creating opportunities for local businesses. Investing in education and healthcare is another crucial aspect of true independence. A well-educated and healthy population is the foundation of any prosperous society. By prioritizing these sectors, African countries can build the human capital needed for sustainable development. This includes improving access to quality education at all levels, from primary schools to universities, and ensuring that healthcare services are accessible and affordable for all citizens. Creating fair trade relationships is also essential for achieving true independence. This involves negotiating trade agreements that are equitable and beneficial for African producers. It means rejecting exploitative practices and insisting on fair prices for African goods. It also means fostering regional integration and cooperation, which can strengthen African economies and reduce their vulnerability to external shocks. Historical examples provide valuable lessons for this journey. Leaders like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana championed policies of self-reliance and anti-imperialism. Sankara's government, for instance, implemented land reforms, promoted local agricultural production, and sought to reduce dependence on foreign aid. Although his tenure was short-lived, his legacy continues to inspire those who seek a path of genuine autonomy. Contemporary movements also offer hope. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, aim to boost intra-African trade and economic integration. By reducing tariffs and barriers, AfCFTA seeks to create a single market that can compete on the global stage. Such efforts are crucial for building the economic resilience needed to withstand external pressures and exploitative practices. Traore's vision for true independence challenges African leaders to embrace a new paradigm of governance rooted in self-reliance, solidarity, and mutual respect. It calls for a break from the past and a commitment to policies that empower African communities and foster sustainable development. Also, we have seen many times Traore saying the same thing as Malcolm X. So how does Traore's rhetoric resonate with the legacy of Malcolm X? The parallels between Traore's speech and Malcolm X's rhetoric are unmistakable. Both leaders use provocative language and historical references to expose the deep-seated injustices faced by their people. just as Malcolm X called out the internalized oppression within the African American community. Traore exposed the complicity of African leaders in maintaining neocolonial structures. Malcolm X's famous speeches often highlighted the psychological and social dimensions of oppression. He distinguished between the house slave and the field slave to illustrate how some individuals, despite being oppressed, could become enforcers of the oppressive system. This internalized oppression, Malcolm X argued, was one of the most insidious forms of control, as it perpetuated the status quo from within. Traore's invocation of the house slave metaphor served a similar purpose. It highlighted how certain African leaders have internalized the values and interests of their former colonial masters, becoming willing participants in the exploitation of their people. This critique was not just about individual leaders, but about a broader system of governance that prioritizes external approval over genuine independence. Yet, like Malcolm X, Traore's message went beyond mere criticism. He offered a vision of empowerment and self-determination, urging African leaders to reclaim their agency and prioritize the collective good over individual gain. This call to action was a reminder that true liberation requires not only the dismantling of external oppressors, but also a critical examination of internal dynamics. The resonance between Traore's rhetoric and Malcolm X's legacy is an example of the enduring relevance of their messages. Both leaders challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths and to strive for a future defined by justice and equality. As we consider Traore's vision for Africa, we must also reflect on the broader implications of his call for liberation and solidarity. Malcolm X's influence on Traore's rhetoric is also evident in the emphasis on self-reliance and empowerment. Malcolm X famously advocated for Black self-determination and economic independence, urging African Americans to build their institutions and support their communities. This message of self-reliance resonates deeply with Traore's vision for Africa, which calls for the development of local industries and the rejection of exploitative practices. Moreover, both leaders understood the importance of international solidarity. Malcolm X's travels to Africa and his efforts to build alliances with leaders across the continent reflected his belief in the global struggle against imperialism and racism. Traore's call for African unity and cooperation echoes this sentiment, emphasizing the need for a collective response to neocolonialism. The legacy of Malcolm X also highlights the importance of grassroots activism and community organizing. Malcolm X recognized that true change would not come from the top down, but from the bottom up, driven by the efforts of ordinary people demanding justice and equality. Traore's vision for Africa similarly emphasizes the role of grassroots movements and civil society in driving the struggle for independence and self-determination. So, like Malcolm X, can Traore's vision become a reality in the current geopolitical landscape? Ibrahim Traore's speech has ignited a renewed sense of hope and urgency among those who long for a truly independent Africa. His bold and uncompromising stance has resonated with a generation that is increasingly disillusioned with the empty promises of post-colonial governance. For many, Traore represents a new breed of African leader, one who is unafraid to challenge the status quo and demand a future free from the shadows of imperialism. The potential for Traore's vision to become a reality depends on several factors. First and foremost is the willingness of African leaders to embrace his call for true independence. This requires a collective commitment to rejecting neocolonial influences and prioritizing policies that benefit African communities. It also demands a willingness to confront and address internal corruption and governance issues that have hindered progress. International solidarity and support will also play a crucial role. Traore's vision of self-reliance does not mean isolationism. Rather, it calls for fair and equitable partnerships that respect Africa's sovereignty and contribute to its sustainable development. Global movements for social justice and anti-imperialism can provide valuable support and amplify the voices of those advocating for change. Moreover, the resilience and agency of African communities themselves cannot be underestimated. Grassroots movements, civil society organizations, and youth activists are already at the forefront of the struggle for genuine independence. Their efforts to hold leaders accountable, promote sustainable development, and foster Pan-African solidarity are critical to realizing Traore's vision. The international community also has a role to play in supporting Africa's quest for true independence. This includes challenging exploitative trade practices, promoting fair trade, and advocating for debt relief. It also means supporting African-led initiatives and respecting the sovereignty and autonomy of African nations. Traore's vision also calls for a rethinking of development paradigms. Traditional models of development, which often prioritize economic growth over social and environmental well-being, have failed to address the root causes of poverty and inequality in Africa. A new approach is needed, one that prioritizes human development, social justice, and environmental sustainability. This new approach requires a shift in how we measure progress. Instead of focusing solely on GDP growth, we should consider indicators such as access to education and healthcare, income equality, and environmental health. By adopting a more holistic and equitable approach to development, African countries can build societies that are not only economically prosperous, but also socially and environmentally sustainable. One question remains: will Traore's vision become a reality? Can African nations unite to cast off the yoke of neocolonialism and build a future defined by sovereignty, equity, and justice? Let us know in the comment section. Do you think Traore will bring change? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.